It's 2 a.m. You're sitting alone in a security booth surrounded by thousands of silent graves. The only light comes from your flickering flashlight and the pale glow of your security monitors. Every shadow could hide something watching you back. Every sound could be your last warning. Tonight, I'm bringing you 10 real accounts from cemetery night guards across America. Men and women who thought they signed up for quiet nights and easy money. Instead, they discovered that death doesn't always mean rest. These aren't your typical ghost stories found in dusty books. These are first-hand testimonies from people who clocked in for the night shift and clocked out forever changed. Some quit after their first week. Others lasted years, becoming unwilling witnesses to things that science cannot explain. But all of them share one thing in common. They learned that cemeteries after dark are not places for the living. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever walked through a cemetery at night? If you have, you might recognize some of these experiences. If you haven't, well, after tonight, you probably never will. So dim the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare yourself. Because once you hear these stories, you'll never look at a cemetery the same way again. Marcus Rodriguez never believed in ghosts. A former Marine with 2 tours in Afghanistan, he figured guarding a cemetery in Baltimore would be the easiest job he'd ever had. Dead people don't cause trouble, he used to say. How wrong he was. Woodlawn Cemetery sits on 300 acres of rolling hills, established in 1853. By day, it's peaceful, almost beautiful. Families visit, groundskeepers maintain the elaborate Victorian monuments, and tourists photograph the historic mausoleums. But night transforms it into something else entirely. Marcus started his first shift on a Tuesday in October. The previous guard had quit without notice, leaving behind only a hastily scribbled note that read, "I can't do this anymore." Marcus laughed it off. Probably some college kid who got spooked by a raccoon. The security booth sat at the center of the cemetery, surrounded by towering oak trees that blocked most of the streetlight. Marcus settled in with his coffee and a book, expecting a boring but lucrative night. The pay was surprisingly good for such simple work. Red flag number 1, though he didn't realize it yet. Around midnight, Marcus decided to do his first patrol. The cemetery required hourly walks along the main paths, checking for vandals or trespassers. He grabbed his flashlight and radio, locked the booth, and stepped into the October air. The silence hit him first. No traffic sounds, no distant music, no city noise. Just his footsteps on gravel and the whisper of wind through dead leaves. Marcus had experienced silence in the desert, but this felt different. Heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. He followed the main path toward the older section, where elaborate Victorian monuments cast twisted shadows in his flashlight beam. Marble angels seemed to watch him pass. Stone children frozen in eternal play appeared to turn their heads slightly when he wasn't looking directly at them. "Get a grip, Rodriguez," he muttered to himself, but his military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was screaming danger. That's when he saw the woman. She stood about 50 yards ahead, beside a tall obelisk monument. At first glance, she looked normal. Average height, long dark hair, wearing what appeared to be a white dress. But she was perfectly still, unnaturally so. No swaying, no breathing movements, no shifting weight from foot to foot like living people do unconsciously. Marcus called out, "Ma'am, the cemetery is closed. I'm going to need you to leave." She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his voice. He walked closer, hand instinctively moving to where his sidearm would have been in the military. The security company didn't provide weapons, another detail that seemed odd in hindsight. "Ma'am, did you hear me?" 20 feet away now, Marcus could see her more clearly. The white dress was actually a nightgown, thin and flowing. Her hair hung straight down her back, so long it nearly touched the ground. But it was her stillness that unnerved him most. She stood like a statue, facing away from him toward a particular grave. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you need to leave now." This time she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she began to turn toward him. Marcus felt his blood freeze. Where her face should have been, there was nothing. No features, no expression, just smooth, pale skin like unfinished marble. Marcus backed away, fumbling for his radio. But when he looked up again, she was gone, simply vanished. He swept his flashlight across the area, checking behind every monument, every tree. Nothing. His radio crackled with static, then silence. He tried calling dispatch. Nothing. The device was dead, though it had been working fine minutes earlier. Marcus practically ran back to the security booth, his military composure finally cracking. He locked the door and checked all the windows, though he wasn't sure what good it would do against something that could vanish at will. The rest of the night passed without incident, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow outside the booth seemed to move independently. Every noise made him jump. When dawn finally broke, he'd never been so grateful to see sunrise. He almost quit that morning. But Marcus Rodriguez hadn't survived 2 combat tours by running from the unknown. Besides, he needed the job. Rent was due, and good-paying security work was hard to find for veterans. The second night was quieter. No mysterious women, no vanishing figures. Just a long, boring shift exactly as advertised. Marcus began to wonder if stress and unfamiliar surroundings had made him imagine the whole thing. But during his 2 a.m. patrol, he found something that made his stomach drop. Fresh flowers on the grave where the woman had been standing. White roses that hadn't been there the day before. The headstone read, "Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, beloved wife and mother, 1834 to 1859. Marcus asked the groundskeeper about it the next morning. The man, a weather-beaten local named Pete who'd worked the cemetery for 30 years, just shook his head. "Nobody's visited that grave in decades," Pete said. "Sarah's family line died out back in the 1920s. And another thing, those flowers you described, white roses were her favorite. Says so right there in the old records." That night, Marcus saw her again. And again the night after that. Always in the same white nightgown, always perfectly still until she sensed his presence. Then the slow turn, the featureless face, and the inevitable vanishing. But on his 5th night, something changed. Instead of disappearing, she began to walk. Slowly, deliberately, she moved deeper into the older section of the cemetery. Against every survival instinct screaming at him to run, Marcus followed. She led him through a maze of crumbling headstones and overgrown paths to a section he'd never seen before. Ancient graves dating back to the 1800s, many so weathered the names were illegible. She stopped beside a small, simple headstone that read Morrison Family Plot. For the first time, she turned to face him completely. Where her face should have been, features began to appear like an old photograph developing. Sad eyes, a gentle mouth, high cheekbones. She was beautiful, but her expression was one of infinite sorrow. She raised one pale hand and pointed at the ground beside the headstone. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared weeks ago, she was gone. The next morning, Marcus convinced Pete to help him investigate. What they found changed everything. Beneath a thin layer of soil and decades of fallen leaves was another headstone, small and broken. The inscription was barely readable. "Baby Morrison, born and died October 15th, 1859. Pete consulted the cemetery records. Sarah Morrison had died in childbirth. Her baby had lived for only a few hours. But in the chaos following Sarah's death, the infant had been buried in an unmarked grave, separated from its mother. That night, Marcus waited in the security booth until Sarah appeared. When she did, he was ready. He'd spent his own money on white roses and a small teddy bear. He walked directly to her usual spot and spoke clearly. "Sarah, I know about your baby. I know you're looking for your child." She turned toward him, but this time her face was fully formed, no longer blank. Tears flowed down her translucent cheeks. "We found the grave," Marcus continued. "We're going to move your baby tomorrow, right next to you where it belongs." Sarah Morrison smiled then, the first time Marcus had seen joy instead of sorrow in her expression. She nodded once, placed her hand over her heart in a gesture of gratitude, and faded away like morning mist. The cemetery arranged for a proper reburial at no cost. Word of Sarah's story had spread among the staff, and everyone wanted to help reunite mother and child. They even commissioned a small headstone with the baby's name recovered from old records. Thomas Morrison. Marcus never saw Sarah again, but sometimes, during his patrols, he'd find fresh white roses on both graves. The groundskeepers swore they never planted them. Visitors sometimes reported seeing a woman in white walking peacefully through that section of the cemetery. No longer searching, no longer lost. Marcus worked Woodlawn Cemetery for 3 more years. He saw other things, experienced other encounters that would fill a dozen more stories. But none affected him like Sarah Morrison, the mother who couldn't rest until her child was found. He kept that job longer than any guard before him, eventually training new hires and sharing the unspoken rules of cemetery security. Rule number 1. Not all the residents are actually resting in peace. Rule number 2. Sometimes they need help from the living to find their way. But the most important rule, the one Marcus learned from Sarah: the dead aren't always your enemy. Sometimes they're just people who need someone to listen, someone to care, someone to help them finish what they couldn't complete in life. And sometimes helping them is the most human thing you can do. Jennifer Walsh thought she understood grief. As a hospice nurse for 15 years, she'd comforted hundreds of families through their darkest hours. Death was familiar territory. When budget cuts forced early retirement at 52, the night guard position at Riverside Memorial Cemetery seemed like a natural transition. Quiet, peaceful, and a chance to earn extra income while she decided her next career move. Riverside Memorial stretched across the banks of the Missouri River, established in 1887 to serve the growing industrial city. Unlike the ornate Victorian cemeteries of the East Coast, Riverside was practical, organized in neat grid patterns with simple headstones and modest family plots. By day, it felt more like a park than a burial ground. Jennifer's first week passed uneventfully. She'd set up her portable heater in the security trailer, brought crossword puzzles and audiobooks, and settled into a routine. The pay was decent, the work was easy, and her biggest concerns were staying awake during the quiet hours. That changed on a Friday night in February. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Jennifer noticed headlights at the cemetery entrance. Not unusual, people sometimes drove by slowly, paying respects to family members even after visiting hours. But these lights turned into the cemetery and moved along the main road at walking pace. Jennifer grabbed her flashlight and radio, checking the visitor log. No scheduled services, no maintenance crews, no exceptions for late-night access. Whoever was driving had either climbed the gate or found another way in. She followed the taillights in her security cart, staying far enough back to observe without confronting what might be vandals or teenagers looking for trouble. The vehicle, an older sedan, stopped in Section C, about halfway through the cemetery. The headlights went dark. Jennifer waited, watching from behind a large memorial. After 10 minutes, she saw a figure exit the car. Even from a distance, she could tell it was a woman. Medium height, wearing what looked like a heavy coat, moving slowly toward a particular grave. The smart play was to call for backup or contact police. But something about the woman's movements suggested grief rather than mischief. Jennifer had seen enough mourners to recognize the body language, the careful steps, the slightly bowed head, the way sorrow weighs on someone's shoulders. Still, rules were rules. Jennifer drove closer, stopping about 30 feet away and turning on her cart's spotlight. "Excuse me, ma'am. The cemetery is closed to visitors. I'm going to need to ask you to leave." The woman looked up, and Jennifer's breath caught. Even in the harsh LED light, she could see the woman was elderly, probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. But it was her expression that stopped Jennifer cold. Pure, devastating grief. The kind of anguish that comes from losing everything that mattered. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just a few more minutes. I won't cause any trouble." Jennifer should have insisted. Company policy was clear, no exceptions for after-hours visitors. But something in the woman's tone, the desperate politeness of someone who'd run out of options, made her pause. "What's your name?" Jennifer asked, stepping out of the cart but keeping her distance. "Eleanor Hensley. This is my husband's grave. Today would have been our 53rd wedding anniversary." Jennifer felt her professional resolve crumble. She'd seen anniversary visits before, knew how the significant dates could overwhelm surviving spouses with the need to be close to their loved ones. "How did you get in?" "The gates are locked." Eleanor smiled sadly. "I know where the groundskeepers keep the key. My husband worked here for 22 years. Maintenance supervisor. He knew every inch of this place." Against her better judgment, Jennifer made a decision that would change everything. 10 minutes, she said. "Then I have to ask you to leave. And next time, please call ahead. We might be able to arrange something." Eleanor nodded gratefully and turned back to the headstone. Jennifer retreated to her cart, giving the woman privacy but staying close enough to ensure safety. 10 minutes became 20. Jennifer found herself reluctant to interrupt what was obviously a deeply personal moment. Eleanor knelt by the grave, speaking in low tones, occasionally touching the headstone with trembling fingers. When she finally stood and walked back toward her car, Eleanor stopped beside Jennifer's cart. "Thank you. I know you bent the rules for me. It means more than you know." "Was that your car I saw leaving?" Jennifer asked. Eleanor looked confused. "What do you mean?" "The car that brought you here. The sedan. I don't drive anymore. My eyes aren't good enough for night driving. I walked here from the bus stop." Jennifer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. "Ma'am, I followed a car into the cemetery. I saw headlights, taillights, heard an engine." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "There's no car. I took the number 7 bus, got off at Riverside Avenue, and walked through the hole in the back fence. Same way I've been coming for the past 6 months." Jennifer swept her flashlight across the area where she'd seen the sedan parked. No tire tracks in the soft earth. No oil stains on the pavement. No sign that a vehicle had ever been there. 6 months. Jennifer repeated. "You've been coming here regularly?" "Every Friday night. Same time, same routine. I know it's against the rules, but I can't help myself. Friday nights were our date nights for over 50 years. Even after Harold got too sick to go out, we'd sit together and watch our old movies. Now I sit with him here." Jennifer's mind raced. She'd been working the Friday night shift for 3 weeks. If Eleanor had been visiting regularly, why was this the first time she'd seen her? "Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and please don't take offense. Are you sure you've been coming here every Friday? I've been the night guard for almost a month, and I've never seen you before." Eleanor looked genuinely surprised. "Of course I'm sure. Every Friday at 11:45. I stay until midnight, then walk home. I've seen the security person before, but they usually just drive by without stopping. Describe the security person you've seen. Young man, maybe early 30s. Thin, tall, drives one of those small trucks instead of a cart. Always waves but never approaches. Much friendlier than the day staff. Jennifer felt her skin crawl. She was the only night guard assigned to Fridays. There was no young man, no truck, no other security personnel. Mrs. Hensley, what's today's date? February 15th, 2023. Harold's birthday is next week. Would have been his 76th. Jennifer checked her phone. February 15th, 2024. Eleanor was off by exactly 1 year. Mrs. Hensley, I need you to look at this. Jennifer showed her the phone's date display. Eleanor stared at the screen for a long moment, confusion creeping across her features. That can't be right. Harold just died 6 months ago. Last August. The funeral was... Her voice trailed off as memory and reality collided. Jennifer watched understanding dawn in the elderly woman's eyes, followed immediately by terror. What year is it really? Eleanor whispered. 2024. Mrs. Hensley, when exactly did your husband die? August 15th, 2022. Eleanor's legs gave out. Jennifer caught her before she could fall, helping her sit on a nearby bench. That was 18 months ago, Jennifer said gently. You've been visiting him much longer than 6 months. Eleanor began to cry. Not the quiet tears of grief, but the desperate sobs of someone whose world was dissolving. I don't remember most of last year. The doctors said it was depression, that trauma could affect memory, but I thought they meant little things. Not whole months. Not a year of my life. Jennifer sat beside her, offering the comfort she'd given so many families before. But this situation was unlike anything in her experience. A grieving widow, lost in time, somehow invisible to previous security guards, accompanied by phantom vehicles that only Jennifer could see. Mrs. Hensley, where do you think you've been living this past year? The house on Maple Street. Same house Harold and I bought in 1978. I've been maintaining it, paying bills, taking care of everything. Jennifer knew Maple Street. It was 6 miles away, far too long a walk for an elderly woman in winter weather. And if Eleanor had been walking that distance every Friday for over a year, someone would have noticed. Have you talked to anyone else recently? Family? Friends? Neighbors? Eleanor thought carefully. Harold's sister calls sometimes. She's worried about me, says I sound confused. She wanted me to move to assisted living, but I told her I was fine. I am fine, aren't I? The question hung in the cold air like a prayer without an answer. Jennifer made a decision that went far beyond her job description. Mrs. Hensley, I'm going to drive you home tonight, and I think we should call someone to check on you. Do you have Harold's sister's phone number? The ride to Maple Street revealed more disturbing details. Eleanor directed Jennifer to a house that had clearly been empty for months. Dead plants on the porch, newspapers piled by the door, notices from utility companies taped to the windows. This isn't right, Eleanor whispered. I was here this morning. I made coffee, watched the news. Where are my things? Jennifer called the police, not as a security guard dealing with a trespasser, but as a human being who'd found someone in crisis. The responding officers were kind but efficient. Eleanor Hensley had been reported missing by her sister-in-law 8 months earlier. She'd been found wandering several times, always near the cemetery, but had somehow kept disappearing from social services and medical evaluations. The house on Maple Street had been sold to pay for her care at Riverside Manor, a memory care facility 3 miles from the cemetery. Eleanor had walked away from supervised visits and group activities more than 20 times, always on Friday nights, always returning on Saturday mornings with no memory of where she'd been. "How is she getting to the cemetery?" Jennifer asked the officer. "That's a 3-mile walk for someone with dementia. That's what we can't figure out. She's done it in snow, rain, and freezing temperatures. Never shows signs of exposure or exhaustion. The facility has tried everything: locked doors, alarms, 24-hour supervision. She still finds a way out every Friday." As paramedics gently helped Eleanor into an ambulance for evaluation, she grabbed Jennifer's hand. "The young man in the truck," Eleanor said urgently. "He's not real, is he?" "None of it's real. The car, the drives here, the conversations with Harold. I'm losing my mind." Jennifer squeezed her hand. "You're not losing your mind. You're sick, but that's not the same thing. And your love for Harold, that's real. That's the most real thing about any of this." Eleanor nodded, tears flowing freely. "Will you tell him? When you do your rounds, will you tell Harold I tried to keep our date? That I wanted to be with him? I will. I promise." Jennifer never saw Eleanor Hensley again, but she kept her promise. Every Friday at 11:45, she stopped by Harold Hensley's grave and delivered a simple message: "Eleanor loves you and Mrs. Date Night." She worked at Riverside Cemetery for 2 more years, and every Friday she saw the ghost car's headlights, heard the phantom engine, watched invisible tire tracks appear in the soft earth. The cemetery was being visited by the echo of Eleanor's grief, a love so strong it transcended illness and memory, creating its own reality in the space between the living and the dead. Other guards reported similar phenomena on Friday nights: cars that weren't there, visitors who couldn't be found, conversations with people who cast no shadows. The Friday night shift became the hardest to fill, but Jennifer always volunteered. She understood now that cemeteries weren't just places where the dead were buried. They were places where love refused to die, where the past insisted on the present, where the heart's deepest needs could bend reality itself. And sometimes the most haunting ghosts weren't the ones who had died, but the ones who were still alive, still loving, still fighting to keep their promises to the dead. Thomas Mitchell had been security supervisor at Arlington National Cemetery for 12 years, but he'd never worked the night shift in Section 27. That changed when budget cuts forced consolidation of security routes, and Tom found himself responsible for the older, less visited areas of America's most hallowed ground. Section 27 held a dark secret. Tucked away in a corner of the cemetery, largely unmarked and rarely discussed in official tours, lay the remains of Confederate soldiers who died in Union hospitals during the Civil War. For over a century, these graves were marked only with numbers, their identities lost to bureaucracy and the victor's version of history. Tom learned this history during his first briefing about the new route. His supervisor, a career military man named Colonel Harrison, seemed uncomfortable discussing the assignment. "Look, Mitchell, I'm going to be straight with you. We've had incidents in that section. Guards quitting without notice, reports of unusual activity, that sort of thing. I don't believe in ghost stories, but I do believe in facts. Fact is, we can't keep security personnel assigned there." "What kind of incidents?" Tom asked. "Equipment malfunctions, radios going dead, flashlights failing, security cameras showing static. And the guards report seeing things. Civil War-era figures, sounds of battle, voices calling out in distress. Complete nonsense, of course, but it affects morale." Tom nodded. He was former Army himself, 2 tours in Iraq, and he'd learned to separate imagination from reality under stress. "Any actual security breaches? Vandalism, theft, trespassers? That's the strange part. No, whatever's happening there, it doesn't seem to affect cemetery security in any measurable way. It's more like atmospheric disturbance." Tom accepted the assignment. The pay increase was substantial, and he needed the money for his daughter's college tuition. Besides, after seeing real combat, how scary could an old cemetery be? His first night on the expanded route, Tom decided to familiarize himself with Section 27 during daylight hours before his shift. What he found was sobering. Rows of small, identical headstones marked only with numbers. No names, no dates, no indication these had been human beings with families, dreams, and stories. A small placard, recently installed, provided minimal context. Confederate soldiers who died in local hospitals, 1862 to 1865, interred with military honors according to the customs of the time. Tom counted 482 graves. 482 men who died far from home, buried among enemies, forgotten by history until a bureaucratic decision in the 1990s finally acknowledged their existence with proper military headstones. That night, Tom's first patrol through Section 27 felt normal. Quiet, peaceful, appropriately solemn. He radioed in his status every hour as required, checked the perimeter for any signs of intrusion, and noted nothing unusual in his log. It was during his 3 a.m. patrol that he first heard the singing. Soft, barely audible, coming from somewhere among the Confederate graves. A melody Tom didn't recognize, sung in a southern dialect that was distinctly different from modern accents. Multiple voices, harmonizing like a church choir or military unit, singing around a campfire. Tom approached cautiously, hand on his radio, flashlight beams sweeping across the numbered headstones. The singing continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As he got closer, he could make out individual words. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. Tom recognized it as an old hymn, the kind his grandmother used to sing. But the version he was hearing included verses he'd never heard before, and the harmony was complex, practiced, like men who'd sung together many times. He followed the sound to the center of the Confederate section, where the singing was loudest. But when he arrived, there was nothing. No people, no source for the voices, nothing but 482 silent graves and the night wind. Tom keyed his radio. "Control, this is Mitchell. I'm investigating possible trespassers in Section 27. Multiple subjects, possibly conducting some kind of service." Static answered him. His radio, which had been working perfectly minutes earlier, was completely dead. The singing stopped abruptly, as if his radio call had been heard and understood. Tom found himself standing alone among the graves, his flashlight the only illumination, feeling suddenly and profoundly unwelcome. He completed his patrol as quickly as possible and returned to the security office to file his report. His radio resumed working normally as soon as he left Section 27. The next night, Tom came prepared. He brought a backup radio, extra batteries for his flashlight, and a digital voice recorder. If something unusual was happening, he intended to document it properly. The singing began again at 3 a.m., same location, same hymn. But this time, Tom noticed something else. His breath was visible in the cold air, but the temperature around the Confederate graves was noticeably warmer. Not hot, just comfortable, like the air inside a church during Sunday service. Tom activated his voice recorder and approached the area where the singing was strongest. What he captured would haunt him for years. "Boys, we got company," said a voice with a thick Virginia accent. "Living company." "I see him," replied another voice, this one with the flat vowels of Kentucky or Tennessee. "Union uniform." "No, wait, different kind of uniform. Modern." "Evening, sir," said a third voice, older, more authoritative. "Don't be afraid. We mean no harm to you or yours." Tom found his voice. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "We're the 15th Virginia Infantry, what's left of us," the older voice replied. "I'm Captain James Whitmore. We've been here a long time waiting. Waiting for what? To go home, sir. We've been waiting to go home. Tom looked around wildly, but saw nothing, just numbered graves and shifting shadows. Yet the voices were clear, distinct, coming from specific directions as if real people were standing there. I don't understand. You are home. This is Arlington. You're buried with honor. Laughter, sad but not bitter. Begging your pardon, sir, but this isn't home. Home is Virginia, Tennessee, Carolina. We died in enemy hospitals, got buried in enemy ground. We've been trying to find our way back for over 150 years. Tom's recorder was capturing everything, though he wouldn't discover until later that the device registered only his side of the conversation. The voices of the dead, apparently, don't translate to electronic recording. What do you need? Tom asked. Our names, Captain Whitmore said. They buried us with numbers like prisoners. No names, no states, no units. How can we find our way home if no one remembers who we were? Over the following weeks, Tom found himself drawn into an impossible project. Using his off-duty time, he began researching the Confederate soldiers buried in Section 27. He visited the National Archives, contacted Civil War historians, and spent countless hours in library microfilm rooms. What he discovered was a bureaucratic tragedy. The Union Army had maintained meticulous records of Confederate prisoners who died in their hospitals. Names, units, home states, dates of death, even cause of death were all documented. But when the soldiers were interred at Arlington, only the burial numbers were transferred. The names were filed away and forgotten. Tom brought printouts of the records on his next shift. As he read names aloud in Section 27, he could hear responses from the invisible soldiers. Private William Anderson, 15th Virginia Infantry, died September 3, 1863. That's me, came a young voice, full of excitement. That's my name. I'm William Anderson from Staunton. Corporal Michael O'Sullivan, 22nd Tennessee, died November 12, 1864. Sweet Mary and Joseph, you found me. The Irish accent was unmistakable. I'm here, boys. I'm Michael O'Sullivan from Nashville. Tom spent hours each night reading names, matching the dead to their identities, giving the nameless numbers their humanity back. With each name restored, he noticed changes in the cemetery. The temperature anomalies lessened. The equipment malfunctions became less frequent. The atmosphere of restless waiting gradually transformed into something resembling peace. But Captain Whitmore remained. Long after the other voices faded, he stayed to speak with Tom. Why are you still here, Captain? I found your record. James Robert Whitmore, 15th Virginia Infantry, from Richmond. I'm the officer's son. Can't leave until all my boys are accounted for. That's the responsibility of command. Tom understood. Military brotherhood transcended death, apparently. Captain Whitmore was waiting for every member of his unit to be properly identified and honored. It took Tom 6 months to research all 482 names. He worked with Civil War reenactment groups, genealogical societies, and military historians to create a comprehensive database of the Confederate soldiers buried in Section 27. His research was so thorough that the Army eventually used it to install proper headstones with names, units, and home states. The night the new headstones were installed, Tom heard Captain Whitmore speak for the last time. Thank you, son. You've given us back our honor. We can rest now. Captain, can I ask you something? Why me? Why did you trust me with this? Because you're a soldier and you understand. Doesn't matter what uniform you wear, what war you fight, what cause you serve. Every soldier deserves to be remembered. Every man deserves to go home. The presence in Section 27 faded gradually over the following months. Other guards reported the area felt normal again. Equipment worked properly. The temperature anomalies disappeared. The sensation of being watched by unseen eyes vanished. Tom continued working at Arlington for 3 more years before retiring. He never heard the Confederate voices again, but he made sure to visit Section 27 during every shift. The numbered graves were gone, replaced by proper military headstones bearing names, units, and home states. Sometimes, on quiet nights, Tom would find small items left at certain graves. Wildflowers that grew in Virginia, stones from Tennessee mountains, sand from Carolina beaches. Family members, after more than a century and a half, had finally found their boys and were bringing them pieces of home. Tom kept his voice recorder, though it held no evidence of his conversations with the dead. But he didn't need proof. He had something better, the knowledge that he'd helped 482 forgotten soldiers complete their final mission. Not to fight, not to win, but simply to be remembered as the men they had been. In the end, that's all any soldier really wants: to serve with honor, to be remembered by name, and when the fighting is over, to go home. Rebecca Santos had worked cemetery security for 8 years across 3 states, but Graceland Cemetery in Chicago presented unique challenges. Established in 1860, it was the final resting place of Chicago's elite: architects, industrialists, politicians, and celebrities. The elaborate monuments and mausoleums made it both a tourist attraction and a target for vandals, grave robbers, and urban explorers seeking Instagram-worthy photos. What Rebecca didn't know was that Graceland harbored a collector who'd been adding to his collection for over a century, and she was about to become his latest obsession. The cemetery sprawled across 119 acres of prime real estate on Chicago's north side. By day, it resembled an outdoor museum of American memorial art. The Inez Clarke Monument, surrounded by its protective glass case after reports of the statue moving during thunderstorms. The haunting sculpture of Eternal Silence, whose face was said to reveal your death if you stared too long. Dozens of elaborate family mausoleums that rivaled European cathedrals in their grandeur. Rebecca's assignment was the night shift, patrolling the grounds from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Good pay, union benefits, and plenty of overtime during busy periods. She'd handled everything from teenagers sneaking in for midnight photo shoots to sophisticated thieves attempting to steal bronze ornaments worth thousands of dollars. Her first month passed normally. Chicago's November weather kept most troublemakers indoors, and Rebecca settled into the rhythm of hourly patrols, security system checks, and endless paperwork. The only unusual incidents were equipment-related: cameras going offline randomly, motion sensors triggering false alarms, and her radio occasionally picking up conversations that sounded like they were coming from the 1920s. Everything changed on the night she encountered Aldrich Pennington. Rebecca was conducting her midnight patrol through the older section when she noticed lights in the Pennington Mausoleum. Not electric lights, the old mausoleums weren't wired for power. These were flickering, warm, like candles or oil lamps. The Pennington Mausoleum was one of Graceland's most impressive monuments. Built in 1889 for railroad baron Harrison Pennington, it stood 3 stories tall with stained glass windows, marble columns, and elaborate bronze doors that had been sealed for decades. According to cemetery records, the last burial was in 1923. Rebecca approached cautiously, hand on her radio. Trespassers occasionally broke into mausoleums seeking shelter or looking for valuables, but the Pennington tomb had been locked with modern security measures specifically because of its historical value. As she got closer, she could hear sounds from inside. Not vandalism or teenage revelry, but something far stranger. Classical music played on what sounded like a gramophone. The scratchy, distant quality of early 20th century recordings. And underneath the music, the soft sound of someone moving around, apparently organizing or arranging objects. Rebecca tried the bronze doors. They were locked tight, just as they should be. But the sounds continued, and the candlelight flickered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows on the ground around the mausoleum. She keyed her radio to call for backup, but the device produced only static. Every piece of electronic equipment on her person, radio, flashlight, cell phone, had stopped working. Even her digital watch had frozen at 11:47. "Good evening, Miss Santos." Rebecca spun around. A man stood about 10 feet away, though she hadn't heard him approach. He was tall, well-dressed in what appeared to be a vintage three-piece suit, complete with pocket watch chain and silk tie. His hair was perfectly styled in a side part that looked like it belonged in an old photograph. Most unsettling were his eyes, pale blue, almost colorless, and completely without warmth. He looked at Rebecca the way a museum curator might examine a new acquisition. "I'm sorry, sir, but the cemetery is closed to visitors. I'm going to need you to leave." The man smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. "Oh, I'm not a visitor, my dear. I'm Aldrich Pennington. This is my home." Rebecca's blood went cold. Aldrich Pennington had been Harrison's son, buried in the family mausoleum in 1923 after dying in a car accident at age 34. She was looking at a man who'd been dead for over a century. "That's impossible," Rebecca said, backing away slowly. "Aldrich Pennington died in 1923. "Did I? How interesting." Aldrich examined his pocket watch with casual interest. "Time moves so strangely here. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like centuries. But I've been keeping busy." "Doing what?" "Collecting, of course. It's what I do, what I've always done." Aldrich gestured toward the mausoleum. "Would you like to see my collection? I think you'd find it fascinating." Against every survival instinct, Rebecca found herself curious. In 8 years of cemetery security, she'd encountered homeless people, vandals, occult enthusiasts, and urban explorers. But she'd never had a conversation with someone who claimed to be a century-old ghost, and definitely never met anyone who radiated such cold intelligence. What kind of collection? Memories, primarily. Moments of intense emotion, captured and preserved. Fear, love, desperation, joy. All the experiences that make humans so interesting. Aldrich began walking toward the mausoleum, and Rebecca found herself following despite her growing terror. The bronze doors, which had been firmly locked moments before, now stood slightly ajar. "How do you collect memories?" "Carefully, with great patience. You see, strong emotions leave impressions, especially in places like this where the barrier between life and death is already thin. I've learned to gather these impressions, to preserve them like pressed flowers in a book." The interior of the mausoleum was impossible. From outside, it appeared to be a single large room with space for maybe a dozen caskets. But inside, Rebecca found herself in something that resembled a Victorian mansion. Rooms full of antique furniture, walls lined with display cases, and everywhere the warm glow of oil lamps and candles. "This can't be real," Rebecca whispered. "Reality is such a limiting concept," Aldrich replied. "I prefer to think of this as a space between realities, where the rules are more flexible." The display cases held the strangest collection Rebecca had ever seen. Glass orbs that seemed to contain swirling mist. Photographs that moved when she wasn't looking directly at them. Books that whispered when she walked past. And everywhere, the sound of voices, crying, laughing, screaming, singing, as if hundreds of conversations were happening just beyond the range of hearing. "Each piece represents someone who died in this cemetery," Aldrich explained. "Their final moments, their strongest emotions, their deepest fears or greatest loves, all preserved for posterity." Rebecca stopped in front of a case containing what looked like a child's music box. Inside, a tiny ballerina spun endlessly while a barely audible voice sang a lullaby. That's Sarah Mitchell, buried in 1954, age 7. Leukemia. Aldrich's voice was clinically detached. She was singing that lullaby to comfort herself when she died. Her mother used to sing it to her. Quite touching, really. This is sick. You're stealing from dead children. I'm preserving what would otherwise be lost forever. These emotions, these final moments, they're the most human thing about death. Without preservation, they simply fade away. I'm creating a museum of the human experience. Rebecca backed toward what she hoped was the door, but the layout of the mausoleum seemed to shift when she wasn't paying attention. Hallways led to rooms that shouldn't exist. Doors opened onto impossible spaces. I've been watching you, Miss Santos. For weeks now, I've observed your patrols, studied your routines, analyzed your emotional patterns. You're quite remarkable. What do you want from me? Your fear. Right now, in this moment, you're experiencing pure terror mixed with fascination. It's intoxicating. Most people flee when confronted with the impossible, but you're still here, still asking questions. That kind of complex emotional response is extremely rare. Aldrich moved closer, and Rebecca could see that he cast no reflection in the glass cases they passed. His footsteps made no sound on the marble floor. I don't want to die here. Oh, my dear girl, you misunderstand. I don't kill anyone. That would destroy the very thing I'm trying to collect. Death creates the emotion, but the living person must experience it voluntarily. I simply encourage people to feel deeply. Rebecca found herself in what appeared to be a library. The shelves held thousands of volumes, but when she looked closely, the books were blank except for single pages that contained handwritten accounts of final moments. Last letters, deathbed confessions, suicide notes, declarations of love from dying spouses. Every person who's ever died in Graceland Cemetery, Aldrich said. Their stories, their final thoughts, all cataloged and preserved. Soon, I'll have enough material to understand the complete spectrum of human mortality. How long have you been doing this? Since my own death in 1923. Car accident, quite sudden. One moment I was driving through Lincoln Park, the next I was lying in a hospital bed, watching my own funeral through the window. The transition was so abrupt that I never fully crossed over. I became stuck between life and death, and in that liminal space, I discovered my ability to collect the final moments of others. Rebecca realized that every question she asked, every emotional response she displayed, was feeding Aldrich's collection. Her fear, her curiosity, her growing horror, all of it was being absorbed somehow, added to his impossible museum. The other guards who quit, she said, you collected from them too. Oh yes, though most were disappointingly simple. Basic fear, nothing more. You're much more complex. Your emotions have layers. Terror? Yes, but also professional pride, genuine curiosity about the supernatural, and underneath it all, a deep sadness that you carry everywhere you go. Rebecca felt exposed, violated. Somehow, this thing was reading her deepest feelings, cataloging them like specimens in a jar. The sadness is particularly interesting, Aldrich continued. It's not fresh grief, that would be too obvious. This is old pain carefully buried. Someone you lost years ago. Someone whose memory you carry like a wound that never quite heals. Stop. Your brother, I think. Military funeral, flag presentation, the whole ceremony. You became a security guard because you couldn't protect him, so now you protect other things. Places, people, property. A noble response to survivors' guilt. Stop it. Rebecca's scream echoed through the impossible library, and she felt something tear loose inside her chest. Years of carefully controlled grief, anger at a war that took her younger brother, rage at God and country and the arbitrary nature of loss. All of it erupted at once, and Aldrich Pennington smiled with genuine pleasure. Magnificent, absolutely magnificent. That kind of deep, complex emotional release is exactly what I've been seeking. The way love and loss and guilt can intertwine into something that transcends simple sorrow. It's poetry made manifest. But as Aldrich moved to capture Rebecca's emotional outburst, something unexpected happened. Her grief was too strong, too pure, too connected to real love and genuine loss. Instead of being absorbed into his collection, it began to disrupt the careful balance he'd maintained for a century. The impossible rooms began to shake. Display cases toppled, releasing their captured emotions back into the world. The whispered voices became screams, then sobs, then laughter as hundreds of final moments broke free from their preservation. "What's happening?" Aldrich demanded, his composure cracking for the first time. "You collected the wrong emotion," Rebecca said through her tears. "Grief isn't just sadness. It's love with nowhere to go. And love doesn't stay captured. It keeps moving, keeps growing, keeps connecting." The mausoleum was dissolving around them, reality reasserting itself as Aldrich's century-long collection escaped. Rebecca felt the presence of everyone who had died in Graceland Cemetery. Not trapped or preserved, but free, moving on to whatever came next. Aldrich Pennington, no longer sustained by his collection of stolen emotions, began to fade. "This isn't possible," he whispered. "I had everything perfectly controlled." "That's your mistake," Rebecca said. "Love can't be controlled. And grief is just love that has nowhere else to go." The last thing Rebecca saw was Aldrich's face, no longer cold and calculating but filled with his own grief. A century of loneliness, of living on stolen emotions instead of creating his own connections. Then he was gone, and she was standing alone outside the Pennington Mausoleum in the cold Chicago night. Her radio crackled back to life. "Santos, report in. You missed your midnight check." Rebecca looked at her watch. 12:03 a.m. Only 16 minutes had passed, though she'd felt like she'd spent hours in Aldrich's impossible museum. She completed her shift without further incident, but she could feel the difference in Graceland Cemetery. The oppressive weight that had hung over certain sections was gone. The electronic equipment functioned normally. The whispers in her radio disappeared. Rebecca worked Graceland for 2 more years, and during that time she noticed changes. Families reported feeling more at peace when visiting graves. The sensation of being watched that had plagued other guards vanished. Visitors left with stories of comfort and closure rather than unease and fear. She never saw Aldrich Pennington again, but sometimes, during her patrols, she would stop at his family mausoleum and speak to the empty air. "I hope you found what you were really looking for. Not collected emotions, but your own. I hope you found peace." The bronze doors remained locked, the interior dark and normal-sized. But Rebecca knew that somewhere, somehow, Aldrich Pennington had finally let go of his collection and allowed himself to feel his own grief, his own love, his own final moment. And in doing so, he had finally learned to rest. Maria Gonzalez had been a pediatric nurse for 25 years before budget cuts forced her into early retirement. At 62, she needed work that wouldn't aggravate her arthritis but would still let her feel useful. The night security position at Willowbrook Cemetery seemed perfect, quiet, low stress, and the pay covered her prescription costs. What Maria didn't expect was to become the unofficial guardian of the children's section, where the smallest residents of Willowbrook had been waiting decades for someone who understood their needs. Willowbrook Cemetery, established in 1892, served the working-class neighborhoods of Detroit. Unlike the grand memorial gardens for the wealthy, Willowbrook was practical and unpretentious. Simple headstones, modest family plots, and in the northeast corner, a section reserved for children who died before their time. The children's section was heartbreaking even in daylight. Tiny graves marked with small headstones, some decorated with weathered toys, others with nothing but dates that showed lives measured in days rather than years. A central monument depicted an angel gathering children in her arms, donated by a local women's club in 1923 after a diphtheria outbreak claimed 37 children in a single winter. Maria's first week passed quietly. She'd set up a comfortable routine in the security trailer, bringing crossword puzzles and herbal tea, checking the grounds hourly as required. The children's section felt especially peaceful during her nighttime patrols. Sad, certainly, but not disturbing. That changed on a Tuesday night in March. Maria was completing her 2 a.m. rounds when she heard something impossible. Children playing. Laughter. The sound of running feet. Whispered conversations like kids trying to stay quiet during a sleepover. The sounds were coming from the children's section. Maria approached carefully, flashlight in hand but not yet turned on. Street lights provided enough illumination to see the general area, and she didn't want to frighten away what might be living children who'd somehow gotten into the cemetery. But as she got closer, Maria realized these weren't living children. She could hear them clearly, at least a dozen voices, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, but she couldn't see anyone. The sounds moved around the section as if invisible kids were playing tag among the headstones. "It's okay," Maria called softly, using the voice she'd developed after decades of calming frightened children in the hospital. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. My name is Maria, and I'm the security guard. Are you playing?" The sounds stopped abruptly, as if everyone had frozen in place. "I used to be a nurse," Maria continued. "I took care of children who were sick or scared. I know what it's like to be in a place where grown-ups make all the decisions." After a long moment, a small voice answered, "Are you going to make us leave? Honey, this is your home. I can't make you leave and I wouldn't want to, but I am curious about why you're playing at night." "We're not supposed to," said another voice, this one slightly older. "The day people get sad when they see us, so we only come out when they're gone." Maria felt her heart break. Even in death, these children were trying to protect the feelings of the adults who visited their graves. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "I'm Lucy. I'm 8 years old. I died of the flu in 1918. "And I'm Tommy," said a boy's voice. "I'm 6. Car accident in 1962. More voices chimed in, a roll call of tragedy spanning over a century. Disease, accidents, birth defects, violence. All the ways children's lives could be cut short, represented in the invisible gathering around Maria. "How many of you are there?" 347, said an authoritative voice that sounded like a teenager. "I keep count. I'm Rebecca. I'm 16, and I've been here the longest. Died in 1894 when the cemetery first opened the children's section." Maria sank down onto a nearby bench, overwhelmed by the magnitude of childhood loss represented around her. "What do you do all night, besides play?" "We take care of the little ones," Lucy explained. "Some of them are scared, especially the babies who died right after birth. They don't understand where they are or why their parents cry when they visit. And we try to help the sad children feel better," Tommy added. "Some kids died scared or in pain, and they can't get past it. We show them how to play again." Maria understood. Even in death, the older children were nurturing the younger ones, creating a family structure to replace what they'd lost. "Is there anything you need? Anything I can do to help?" The question seemed to surprise them. Rebecca's voice came from directly in front of Maria, though she still couldn't see anyone. No adult has ever asked us that before. Usually they just want us to be quiet and stay invisible. Well, I'm asking, what do you need? The children consulted among themselves in whispers Maria could barely hear. Finally, Lucy spoke up. Could you tell our parents we're okay? Some of them visit and cry so hard it makes us sad too. We want them to know we're not alone, that we take care of each other. And could you maybe bring some new toys? Tommy asked hopefully. The ones people leave get weathered and broken, and the really little kids need things to play with. I can do that, Maria said, but I need to understand something. Why can I hear you but not see you? You listen with your heart, Rebecca explained. Most adults listen with their heads, and they can't hear us that way. But you're different. You spent your whole life taking care of children, so you know how to hear what we need. Over the following weeks, Maria developed a routine that went far beyond her security duties. She brought small toys and books, leaving them discreetly around the children's section. She researched the names on the headstones, learning the stories of the children who had died, so she could speak knowledgeably about their lives when families visited. Most importantly, she became a messenger between the living and the dead. When parents visited their children's graves, Maria would find gentle ways to share what she'd learned during her nighttime conversations. She couldn't mention ghosts or supernatural encounters. That would have gotten her fired or institutionalized. Instead, she spoke in terms of feelings and atmosphere. Your daughter's grave always has fresh flowers, even when no one's brought any, she might tell a grieving mother. It's like the other children here take care of each other. Or to a father struggling with guilt over his son's accident. I've worked here for months now, and I can tell you that the children's section has the most peaceful feeling of anywhere in the cemetery. Whatever pain your son experienced, it's over now. The invisible children began to trust Maria completely. During her nightly patrols, they would update her on their activities, who needed extra comfort, which families were struggling with grief, what toys or books would be most appreciated. Mrs. Patterson visited today, Lucy reported one night. She was crying because it's my birthday. Could you maybe leave some birthday flowers tomorrow? Not expensive ones, just some that look like a little girl picked them. Maria began carrying a garden trowel and collecting wildflowers during her daytime hours. The small bouquets she left appeared to grow naturally from the soil around certain graves, as if planted by loving hands. But it was the arrival of a new child that taught Maria the most important part of her role. On a cold night in November, Maria heard a sound she recognized from 25 years of hospital work, the cry of a newborn. Not the healthy wail of a baby demanding attention, but the weak, frightened sound of an infant in distress. The other children were gathered around a fresh grave at the edge of their section. Baby Emily Chun, born and died on the same day, buried just that afternoon. She's so scared, Lucy whispered. She doesn't understand anything. We've been trying to comfort her, but she needs someone who knows about babies. Maria approached the tiny grave, kneeling on the cold ground. She couldn't see baby Emily, but she could hear her crying, could feel the fear and confusion radiating from someone who had experienced only brief moments of life. "Hello, sweet baby," Maria said softly, using the voice she'd perfected in neonatal intensive care units. "I know you're scared. Everything is strange and different, and you miss being safe and warm." The crying quieted slightly. "My name is Maria, and I've helped lots of babies who were scared. You're not alone, Emily. There are other children here who want to take care of you." Maria began to sing a lullaby in Spanish, the same one she'd sung to her own children and later to countless patients. Gradually, baby Emily's cries faded to whimpers, then to silence. "Is she okay?" Tommy asked. "She's sleeping," Maria said. "Babies need lots of sleep to grow strong. Even here, Will she stay a baby forever? Lucy wanted to know. Maria considered the question carefully. I think babies who come here grow up in their own way, not with their bodies, but with their understanding. She'll learn to play and talk and be part of your family. From that night forward, Maria included lullabies in her security rounds. During every patrol through the children's section, she would sing softly, providing comfort to any infant spirits who might need it. The changes in the cemetery were subtle but noticeable. Families reported feeling more at peace after visits. The children's section, which had always felt heavy with sadness, began to feel different. Still sorrowful, but also filled with love and protection. Maria worked at Willowbrook for 4 years before her arthritis forced her to retire completely. On her last night, she sat on the bench in the children's section for hours, saying goodbye to the invisible family she'd grown to love. "Who will take care of you after I'm gone?" she asked. "We'll take care of each other," Rebecca assured her. "We always have, but now we know how to do it better because you taught us. You showed us that grown-ups can listen with their hearts. And we'll teach the next security guard," Lucy added. "If they're the right kind of person, we'll help them hear us too." As dawn approached, Maria felt a sensation she'd never experienced during her years at the cemetery. Gentle pressure on her hands, her shoulders, her cheeks, as if invisible children were hugging her, saying goodbye. "Thank you," came a chorus of voices. "Thank you for hearing us. Thank you for caring. Thank you for helping our families understand that we're okay." Maria left her security badge and keys in the office that morning, but she never really left Willowbrook Cemetery. She visited regularly, bringing flowers and toys, sharing updates about the families she'd helped connect with their lost children. The new security guard was a young man named David, recently out of college, who lasted exactly 3 nights before quitting. His replacement, an older woman named Betty who had also been a nurse, stayed longer. Maria watched from a distance during one of her visits as Betty sat on the bench in the children's section, head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. After a few minutes, Betty nodded and smiled, reaching into her bag to pull out a small stuffed animal. The torch had been passed. The children of Willowbrook Cemetery had found another guardian who knew how to listen with her heart. And in the invisible space between life and death, 348 children continued to play, to comfort each other, and to grow in understanding, watched over by adults who had learned that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to care. Frank Torres had been a Detroit police detective for 30 years when a line-of-duty injury forced him into early retirement. The limp from his shattered leg was permanent, but his detective instincts remained sharp. When Rosedale Cemetery offered him a night security position, Frank saw it as easy money with no pressure. No criminals to chase, no cases to solve, just quiet nights watching over the dead. Rosedale Cemetery had served Detroit's east side since 1922, sprawling across 40 acres of what had once been prosperous neighborhoods. As the city declined, so had the cemetery's surroundings. Drug dealers used the adjacent streets, abandoned houses provided shelter for squatters, and occasional vandalism plagued the older sections. But Frank's biggest challenge wouldn't come from the living. His first month on the job was routine. A few teenagers attempting to climb the fence for social media photos, one homeless man seeking shelter who Frank redirected to a warming center, and the usual minor maintenance issues. Frank settled into the rhythm of hourly patrols, security checks, and paperwork. The only oddity was a recurring incident that happened every Tuesday night at exactly 11:30 p.m. A black sedan would pull up to the cemetery's main gate, idle for exactly 3 minutes, then drive away without the driver ever getting out or attempting entry. Frank ran the license plate through his police contacts. The car belonged to Vincent Caruso, 67, a retired automotive worker with no criminal record. Clean driving record, no outstanding warrants, property taxes paid up to date. Just a regular citizen with some connection to Rosedale Cemetery. On his fourth Tuesday night, Frank decided to make contact. When the black sedan arrived at 11:30, he walked to the gate with his flashlight and security badge visible. "Evening, sir. I'm Frank Torres, head of security here. I've noticed you visit regularly. Is there something I can help you with?" The driver was exactly what Frank expected from the DMV records. An elderly Italian man with silver hair and sad eyes. He looked surprised but not alarmed to be approached. "Sorry if I'm causing trouble," Vincent said through the lowered window. "I don't mean any harm. I come here to think about my daughter." "Your daughter is buried here?" Vincent shook his head. "No, that's the problem. She should be, but she isn't. She's been missing for 43 years. Frank's detective instincts activated immediately. Missing person cases, especially cold ones involving children, were always personal for him. "What happened to your daughter?" "Angela Caruso. She was 16 when she disappeared in 1981. Walking home from her job at the mall, never made it home. Police investigated for years, but never found any trace of her." Frank remembered the case vaguely. It had been before his time on the force, but missing children become part of departmental folklore. Stories passed down through generations of cops who never stop wondering what happened. "Why do you come here specifically?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "This might sound crazy, but I think she's trying to tell me something. About a month ago, I started having dreams about Angela. She's always in this cemetery, standing by a particular grave pointing at something. The dreams are so vivid I wake up thinking I've been here." Frank felt a familiar chill. In 30 years of police work, he'd learned to take seriously the things that couldn't be easily explained. Too many cases had been solved by following hunches, dreams, or coincidences that seemed impossible. "Which grave does she point to in your dreams?" "That's just it. I've never been inside the cemetery at night. I come here, sit in my car, and try to work up the courage to ask someone to let me look around. But it feels crazy, you know? A grown man chasing dreams about his dead daughter." "She's not necessarily dead," Frank said automatically, then caught himself. 43 years without contact pretty much answered that question. "Mr. Caruso, I'm a retired police detective. I've worked missing person cases before. If you want, I could walk through the cemetery with you, see if anything matches what you remember from your dreams." Vincent's face lit up with a mixture of hope and relief. "You'd do that? You don't think I'm losing my mind? I think you're a father who's never stopped looking for his daughter. That's not crazy, that's love." Frank unlocked the main gate and led Vincent into Rosedale Cemetery. The older man seemed to know where he was going despite claiming he'd never been inside before. He walked confidently along the main path, turning left at the maintenance shed, heading directly toward the oldest section. "This is exactly like my dreams," Vincent whispered. "Every detail is the same." They reached a section of graves dating back to the 1920s and 1930s. Vincent stopped abruptly in front of a large family monument surrounded by smaller individual headstones. "There," he said, pointing at a particular grave. "That's where she always stands in my dreams." Frank read the headstone by flashlight. Giuseppe Moretti, 1952 to 1981. Beloved son and brother. The date of death made Frank's detective instincts fire. "Mr. Caruso, your daughter disappeared in 1981? May 15, 1981. Frank checked the headstone again. Giuseppe Moretti had died on May 20th, 1981, 5 days after Angela Caruso disappeared. "Did you ever know anyone named Moretti?" Vincent thought carefully. Not personally, but the name was familiar around the neighborhood. There were rumors about the family being connected to, well, organized crime. Nothing proven, just rumors. Frank's mind was racing. A 16-year-old girl disappears, and 5 days later, a young man from a rumored crime family dies. In his experience, coincidences like that were rarely coincidental. What else happens in your dreams? Angela points at the grave. Then she looks at me and mouths the word help, like she needs me to understand something about this place. Frank walked around the Moretti family plot, examining the area with fresh eyes. The grave itself looked normal, well-maintained, with fresh flowers that appeared to be regularly replaced. But something about the surrounding ground bothered him. "Mr. Caruso, can you describe your daughter? What she was wearing when she disappeared?" "Blue jeans, white blouse, denim jacket. She had a small gold cross necklace, a gift for her confirmation. And she always wore this cheap ring with a red stone. She bought it at the mall where she worked." Frank knelt beside the Moretti headstone, running his flashlight along the ground. There, partially buried in the soil near the base of the monument, was a glint of metal. Using his pen to avoid contaminating potential evidence, Frank carefully unearthed a small, tarnished ring with a red stone. Vincent gasped. "That's Angela's ring. I bought that stone for her myself, had it set at the jewelry counter where she worked." Frank's hands were shaking as he stood up. After 30 years as a detective, he'd never experienced anything like this. A missing person case potentially being solved by dreams and supernatural guidance. "Mr. Caruso, I need to call this in. This is evidence in a missing person case." "But how did her ring get here? What does it mean?" Frank had a theory, but he needed to be careful. "In my experience, evidence doesn't just appear randomly. Someone put this here, either accidentally or intentionally." They waited in the security office while Frank made phone calls to his former colleagues. Even though he was retired, the discovery of potential evidence in a 43-year-old missing person case would reopen the investigation. While they waited, Vincent told Frank more about his dreams. "Angela looks older in the dreams. Not 16 anymore, but the age she would be now if she'd lived. Like she aged in whatever place she's been. And she seems peaceful, not scared or angry, like she's been waiting all these years for someone to find this." Frank had worked enough cases to know that witnesses' family members sometimes developed elaborate fantasies to cope with unresolved loss. But Vincent's description of finding the exact location and the subsequent discovery of evidence suggested something beyond normal psychology. The detective assigned to cold cases, Maria Santos, arrived within an hour. Frank briefed her on the situation, carefully leaving out any mention of dreams or supernatural guidance. "So the victim's father just happened to lead you to this exact spot?" Detective Santos asked skeptically. He'd been visiting the cemetery regularly, had noticed this particular grave. Sometimes family members develop instincts about these things. Santos nodded. She'd been a detective long enough to know that stranger things had broken old cases. "We'll need to process the scene, bring in ground-penetrating radar, maybe do some exploratory excavation." The investigation took 3 weeks. Ground-penetrating radar revealed soil disturbances near the Moretti family plot consistent with an unmarked burial. When excavation began, they found what Vincent had been looking for since 1981. Angela Caruso's remains were buried approximately 6 feet from Giuseppe Moretti's official grave. Forensic analysis confirmed her identity through dental records and the gold cross necklace Vincent had described. The autopsy revealed what Frank had suspected. Angela had been murdered, likely within hours of her disappearance. But more importantly, evidence found with her remains linked Giuseppe Moretti to the crime. According to the forensic reconstruction, Angela had been abducted while walking home from work. Giuseppe Moretti, then 29 and known to police as a low-level associate in organized crime, had apparently killed her either accidentally or in a panic. When he died 5 days later in what had been officially ruled a heart attack, the secret of Angela's location died with him, until Angela herself somehow shared it with her father. Vincent Caruso finally had the closure he'd been seeking for over 4 decades. His daughter received a proper burial in the Catholic cemetery where the family had maintained plots. The case of her disappearance was officially closed. Frank continued working security at Rosedale Cemetery, but with a new understanding of his role. He was no longer just watching over the dead. Sometimes he was helping them communicate with the living. The Tuesday night visits stopped after Angela's remains were found and properly buried. Vincent Caruso no longer needed to sit outside the cemetery gate, and Frank never again saw the mysterious black sedan. But other families began to appear. Parents who'd lost children to violence, siblings searching for answers about missing relatives, spouses who needed closure about unexplained deaths. Word spread quietly through Detroit's networks of the bereaved. If you needed help finding someone, the night security guard at Rosedale Cemetery might be able to help. Frank never claimed any supernatural abilities. He simply listened to families describe their dreams, their hunches, their inexplicable feelings about certain locations. Then he would apply his detective skills to investigate what they told him. Not every case yielded results like Angela Caruso's, but over his 5 years at Rosedale, Frank helped resolve 7 cold cases. Missing persons, unsolved murders, hit-and runs where the victims had never been identified, all solved through the combination of family intuition and professional investigation. Frank never talked about the supernatural aspects publicly. In his reports, he focused on the detective work, following leads, analyzing evidence, coordinating with active investigations. But privately, he came to believe that love really could transcend death, that the bonds between family members were strong enough to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. On quiet nights, when his patrols took him past the Moretti family plot, Frank would sometimes pause and speak to the empty air. "Thank you, Angela. Your father has peace now because of you." The cemetery never answered back in words. But Frank, a man who'd spent 3 decades listening to the voices of victims seeking justice, had learned to hear the silence that meant, "You're welcome." Patricia Williams had managed funeral homes for 22 years before taking the night security position at Evergreen Cemetery. Unlike guards who came from military or law enforcement backgrounds, Patricia understood grief intimately. She'd comforted thousands of families through their darkest moments, knew the rhythms of mourning, and recognized the difference between normal sorrow and something deeper, more dangerous. What she discovered at Evergreen was grief so powerful it had taken on a life of its own. Evergreen Cemetery served the suburbs of Atlanta, established in 1965 during the post-war population boom. Unlike historic cemeteries with their elaborate monuments and winding paths, Evergreen was modern and efficient. Neat rows of uniform headstones, wide roads for maintenance vehicles, and careful landscaping that prioritized accessibility over atmosphere. But efficiency couldn't contain the intensity of human loss, and Evergreen had become a magnet for a particular type of mourner, people whose grief had become their entire identity. Patricia's first week was quiet, routine patrols, and minor maintenance issues. But she began to notice patterns in the daytime visitor logs that concerned her professionally. Certain names appeared daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Flowers and mementos accumulated around specific graves far faster than normal mourning rituals would explain. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday night in September, during Patricia's 3 a.m. patrol. She found them in Section J, gathered around a grave marked Michael Davidson, beloved son, 1985 to 2018. 7 people, ranging in age from middle-aged to elderly, sitting in folding chairs arranged in a circle around the headstone. They weren't talking, weren't praying, weren't conducting any kind of service. They were simply sitting in absolute silence, staring at the grave. Patricia approached carefully. In 22 years of funeral service, she'd seen every variation of grief, but this felt different. Obsessive, unhealthy. "Excuse me, folks. The cemetery is closed to visitors after dark. I'm going to need you to gather your things and leave." None of them looked at her. None of them responded. They continued staring at Michael Davidson's grave as if Patricia hadn't spoken. "Can you hear me? The cemetery closes at sunset. You can't be here." One woman, probably in her 60s, finally turned toward Patricia. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but more disturbing was their expression. Completely empty, as if she was looking through Patricia rather than at her. "We're mourning," the woman said in a flat, emotionless voice. "This is mourning hour. I understand you're grieving, but you need to do it during visiting hours. I can arrange for extended access if you speak with the office, but right now you need to leave." "You don't understand." This from a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "We can't leave. We can't stop. If we stop mourning, he'll really be gone." Patricia felt her funeral director instincts activate. She'd seen pathological grief before. Families who couldn't accept death, who built shrines instead of healing, who replaced living with perpetual mourning. But this was extreme even for her experience. "Who was Michael to you?" she asked gently. "My son," said the empty-eyed woman. "My grandson," said the sleepless man. "My best friend," added a younger woman. "My student," said an elderly man. One by one, they each claimed a relationship to Michael Davidson. Patricia did quick math. 7 mourners meant either Michael had an impossibly large family and friend group, or some of these people were lying about their connection to him. "How did Michael die?" "Car accident," said his supposed mother. "Cancer," said the man claiming to be his grandfather. "Suicide," said the alleged best friend. Patricia's concern deepened. Not only were these people engaging in unhealthy grieving behavior, they couldn't even agree on basic facts about Michael's death. "I'm going to call someone to help you," Patricia said, reaching for her radio. But before she could key the mic, something impossible happened. All 7 mourners turned to look at her simultaneously, with identical expressions of desperate hunger. And when they spoke in unison. "Don't take away our grief. It's all we have left." Patricia backed away, genuinely frightened for the first time in her security career. Whatever was happening here went beyond normal psychological disturbance. "Who are you really? What is this place to you?" The woman who claimed to be Michael's mother stood up slowly. "We're the bereaved. We come here to mourn, and mourning gives us purpose. Without grief, we're nothing. Mourning is supposed to heal you, not consume you. Healing is forgetting. We refuse to forget." The others stood as well, forming a circle around Patricia. She noticed for the first time that despite sitting on folding chairs, none of them had brought the chairs with them. The chairs had simply appeared when needed. "Grief is love with nowhere to go," the supposed grandfather said. "So we come here, where love can find its target." "But Michael isn't here," Patricia said. "He's dead. This is just his grave." "Death is temporary," replied the alleged best friend. "Grief is eternal." Patricia tried a different approach, using techniques she'd learned from decades of grief counseling. "What would Michael want for you? Would he want you sitting here every night, unable to move forward with your lives?" For the first time, the mourners looked uncertain. They exchanged glances, as if the question had never occurred to them. "Michael would want," the supposed mother began, then stopped. "I don't remember what Michael was like alive. I only remember him dead." That's not healthy grief, Patricia said firmly. Healthy grief remembers the person's life, not just their death. We remember, the supposed student protested. We remember the pain of losing him. That's not the same thing. Tell me something Michael enjoyed while he was alive. His hobbies, his dreams, his personality. Silence. 7 people who claimed intimate relationships with Michael Davidson couldn't describe a single detail of his living personality. Patricia walked to Michael's headstone and read the inscription by flashlight. Michael Davidson, beloved son, 1985 to 2018. He brought joy wherever he went. Did he bring you joy? Patricia asked the assembled mourners. When he was alive, did knowing Michael make you happy? Again, uncertain glances between them. The obsessive certainty they'd displayed moments before was wavering. I think, the supposed mother said slowly, I think I used to be happy. Before. Before what? Before I learned to mourn properly. Patricia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September night air. Who taught you to mourn? The mourners pointed simultaneously toward a section of the cemetery Patricia hadn't explored yet, the oldest area, where the first burials had taken place in 1965. She did. The mourning mother. She teaches us how to grieve correctly. Against every survival instinct, Patricia followed the mourners toward the older section of Evergreen. Her funeral director training had taught her that grief counseling sometimes required entering people's delusions in order to guide them back to reality. They led her to a grave that was different from all the others in Evergreen. Instead of the standard granite headstone, this grave was marked by an elaborate monument. A life-sized marble statue of a woman kneeling in prayer, tears carved permanently on her stone cheeks. The inscription read, Helen Morrison, 1932 to 1965. First interment, Evergreen Cemetery. A mother's love never dies. She was the first person buried here, explained the supposed grandfather. She died of grief after losing her own child, and her grief was so perfect, so pure, that it never ended. Patricia felt pieces clicking together in her mind. How many of you have actually lost someone? I mean, recently, someone real? The mourners looked confused by the question. After a long pause, the supposed best friend raised her hand tentatively. My husband died 6 months ago. Heart attack. And you? Patricia asked the supposed mother. I think I lost my cat. Last year. Or maybe it was the year before. One by one, Patricia discovered that these weren't bereaved family members of Michael Davidson. They were people who'd experienced minor losses, pets, distant relatives, ended relationships, and somehow been drawn into professional mourning for a stranger. The mourning mother taught us, the supposed student explained. She showed us that small griefs are selfish. Real grief, important grief, requires dedication. Michael needs mourners, so we mourn him. But you didn't know Michael. We know his death. That's what matters. Patricia approached the marble statue of Helen Morrison. Even in the dim light, she could see that fresh tears seemed to glisten on the carved face, though that was impossible on stone that had weathered for nearly 60 years. Tell me about Helen Morrison, Patricia said. She lost her son in Vietnam in 1964, the supposed mother recited like a memorized lesson. She grieved so deeply that she wasted away and died within a year. When they built this cemetery, her family wanted her to be the first burial, so her grief could sanctify the ground. And you believe her spirit is here, teaching people how to grieve? Not teaching, showing. She shows us that grief is the only honest response to death. That healing is betrayal. That moving on means the dead person didn't matter. Patricia had encountered pathological grief many times in her funeral career, but this was something new. Grief as contagion, spreading from person to person, converting normal sorrow into obsessive mourning. What happens if you don't come here to mourn? Fear crossed their faces. We forget, whispered the supposed best friend. We start to feel normal again. We smile, we laugh, we enjoy things. And that means we didn't really love them. No, Patricia said firmly, using her most authoritative funeral director voice. That means you're healing. That means you're choosing to honor their memory by continuing to live. She turned to address the marble statue directly. Helen Morrison, if you're here, I need to talk with you. I'm Patricia Williams, and I've spent my career helping people through grief. What you're doing to these people isn't help. It's harm. The temperature around the monument dropped noticeably. The 7 mourners stepped back, but Patricia held her ground. Helen, I know you lost your son. I know that pain was unbearable, but look what your grief has become. It's consuming people who never even knew the person they're mourning. A voice, barely audible, seemed to come from the marble statue itself. Grief is love. Love never dies. Love doesn't die, but grief is supposed to transform into something else. Into gratitude for the time you had. Into determination to honor their memory through how you live. Not into this professional mourning for strangers. They need to be mourned. The forgotten dead need tears. No, Helen. The dead need the living to keep living. They need their memory to inspire joy, not just sorrow. Patricia turned back to the 7 mourners. Tell me one thing each of you enjoyed before you started coming here. One thing that used to make you happy. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to remember. Gardening, reading mysteries, cooking for grandchildren, teaching piano. Small pleasures that had been consumed by the obligation to grieve for someone else's loss. Those joys didn't disappear when you experienced loss, Patricia told them. Grief and happiness can exist together. Healthy grief makes room for both. She addressed the statue again. Helen, your son wouldn't want your grief to trap other people. He'd want his mother's love to help people heal, not hurt them. The presence around the monument seemed to waver, like heat shimmer on summer pavement. I don't know how to stop grieving, came the whispered response. You don't have to stop, but you can change how you grieve. Instead of teaching people to mourn strangers, help them honor their own losses while still embracing life. Over the following hour, Patricia guided the most unusual grief counseling session of her career. Speaking sometimes to the living mourners, sometimes to the spirit of Helen Morrison, she helped all of them understand the difference between healthy grief and destructive obsession. The 7 mourners gradually remembered their own identities, their own lives, their own reasons for living. They made plans to return to activities they'd abandoned, to reconnect with family and friends they'd neglected while professional mourning consumed their time. Helen Morrison's presence faded more slowly, but Patricia could feel the desperate hunger that had created the mourning circle beginning to dissipate. Thank you, came one final whisper from the statue. I had forgotten what love looked like when it wasn't drowning in sorrow. Patricia worked at Evergreen Cemetery for 3 more years. The obsessive mourning circles never returned, but she did notice positive changes. Families who visited the cemetery seemed to heal faster, to find comfort rather than just sorrow in their visits. The marble statue of Helen Morrison looked different too. Still sad, but peacefully so, like a mother watching her children from a distance rather than clinging desperately to them. Patricia had learned something important during her night security work. Even in death, love could become corrupted if it wasn't balanced with hope. Her job wasn't just to guard the cemetery from intruders, but to guard the living from being consumed by the intensity of their own devotion. The dead deserved to be remembered, but the living deserved to keep living. And sometimes, helping people understand the difference was the most important security work of all. Robert Bobby Martinez was supposed to retire at 65, but his pension calculations came up short and his wife's medical bills were mounting. When Crescent Hill Cemetery offered him a night security position, Bobby reluctantly accepted what he assumed would be a temporary job to bridge the gap to full retirement. He had no idea he was stepping into a legacy that stretched back over 40 years, or that he would become part of a chain of night guards who had been protecting more than just cemetery property. Crescent Hill Cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the Ohio River, established in 1878 to serve the growing industrial city of Cincinnati. By the 1980s, urban decay had crept up to its borders, and the surrounding neighborhoods had become rough. Drug deals, gang activity, and urban decay made the night shift at Crescent Hill more challenging than typical cemetery security work. But the real challenge came from within the cemetery itself. Bobby's orientation was conducted by Jim Callahan, a weathered man in his 70s who'd worked the night shift at Crescent Hill for 18 years. "The job's pretty straightforward," Jim explained as they toured the grounds. "Patrol every hour, check the gates, watch for vandals or trespassers. But there are some unwritten rules you need to understand." "What kind of unwritten rules?" Jim stopped at a bench overlooking the oldest section of the cemetery. "Bobby, how do you feel about things that can't be explained logically?" "Like what?" "Like voices with no source, shadows that move independently, equipment that works fine everywhere except certain sections. People who've been dead for decades but still have opinions about how their graves are maintained." Bobby had been a practical man his entire life, 35 years as a machinist at a tool factory, 2 tours in Vietnam, raised 4 kids on a blue-collar salary. He didn't believe in ghost stories. "Are you trying to scare me away from this job?" "No, I'm trying to prepare you for it. See, Crescent Hill has been watched over by night guards since 1963. Not just watched over, protected. And every guard who's lasted more than a month has had to come to terms with the fact that death doesn't end everyone's connection to this place." Jim led Bobby to a section near the maintenance shed where a simple stone marker read, "Harold Fisher, 1923 to 1963, First Night Watchman, Crescent Hill Cemetery." Harold was hired when the cemetery started having problems with vandalism. Grave robbing, monument damage, that sort of thing. But after a few weeks on the job, Harold realized the real problems were coming from inside the cemetery. Some of the dead weren't resting peacefully. Bobby nodded politely, trying to hide his skepticism. Harold figured out how to communicate with them, how to understand what they needed. Some wanted their graves maintained properly. Others needed messages delivered to living family members. A few were concerned about newcomers being buried nearby. "And you believe Harold could actually talk to ghosts?" "I believe Harold cared enough to listen when the dead tried to communicate. And I believe that caring is what's kept this cemetery peaceful for 60 years. Jim showed Bobby a logbook hidden in the security office filing cabinet. It was filled with handwritten entries dating back to 1963, notes from night guards describing encounters, requests from deceased residents, and solutions that had worked to resolve supernatural conflicts. Every night guard who's worked here more than a month has contributed to this log. It's the real manual for this job. Bobby read a few entries. March 15, 1975, Mrs. Henderson in Section C is upset about the new streetlight near her grave. Says it's too bright for proper rest. Spoke with City Works, had light redirected. Problem resolved. Mike S. October 3, 1982, Mr. Kowalski reports teenagers using his headstone as a table for drug deals. Increased patrols in that area. Contacted police for regular drive-bys. Teenagers moved elsewhere. Dave R. December 12, 1995, baby Sarah in the children's section was crying, audibly, during cold nights. Left small blanket by her grave. Crying stopped. Tom W., this is all made up, right? Bobby asked. Some kind of hazing ritual for new guards? Jim's expression was completely serious. Bobby, I'm 73 years old. I've seen 3 wars, buried both my parents and one of my children, and survived cancer twice. I don't have time for practical jokes. Every entry in that book is real, and if you take this job seriously, you'll be adding your own entries before long. Bobby's first week was uneventful. He followed the basic security protocols, hourly patrols, perimeter checks, incident reports for anything unusual. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful, and completely normal. But during his second week, Bobby began to notice things that didn't quite fit. During his Tuesday night patrol, he found fresh flowers on a grave in Section D despite the fact that no visitors had been logged during business hours. The flowers were wildflowers, the kind that grew in vacant lots, arranged with the care someone might show for a loved one's birthday. On Thursday, Bobby discovered that someone had been cleaning headstones in the oldest section of the cemetery. Not professional cleaning, the kind of gentle scrubbing a family member might do with soap and water and an old toothbrush. But no maintenance work was scheduled, and the day staff hadn't done any cleaning in that area. Friday night brought Bobby's first direct encounter with Crescent Hill's unusual residents. During his 2 a.m. patrol, Bobby heard conversation coming from near the Harold Fisher Memorial. 2 voices, both elderly men, discussing baseball scores and complaining about the current state of the Cincinnati Reds. Bobby approached carefully, expecting to find trespassers or homeless people seeking shelter. But when he reached the area where the voices were coming from, there was no one there. "Hello," Bobby called. "Is someone there?" "Evening, Bobby." The voice came from directly behind him, though when he turned, he saw nothing. "I'm Harold Fisher. Jim probably told you about me." Bobby felt his worldview shifting. This isn't possible. Lots of things aren't possible until they happen. You settling in okay? Job treating you fairly? Despite the impossibility of the situation, Bobby found himself answering. "It's fine. Quiet work, good pay. Though I'm not sure how long I'll stay. That's what they all say at first. But this job grows on you. We grow on you. We, the permanent residents. We've been waiting for Jim to retire so we could meet the new guy." Over the following weeks, Bobby gradually became acquainted with the active residents of Crescent Hill Cemetery. Not all the dead were active. Most rested peacefully and never made their presence known. But a core group of about 20 individuals remained engaged with the world of the living, and they had been working with the night guards for decades to maintain the cemetery's well-being. Harold Fisher served as unofficial spokesman for the group. A former factory worker like Bobby, he had died of a heart attack while on duty in 1963, but his sense of responsibility had apparently survived death. "We're not ghosts in the Halloween sense," Harold explained during one of their conversations. "We don't haunt or frighten people. We're more like permanent volunteers. We care about this place, and we try to help maintain it." Bobby learned that the mysterious flowers were placed by Mrs. Kowalski, who had died in 1978 but continued to decorate graves that looked lonely or neglected. The nighttime headstone cleaning was performed by a group of deceased veterans who took pride in keeping military graves properly maintained. "Why don't you rest in peace like everyone else?" Bobby asked. "Some of us tried," Harold replied. "But we realized we were more useful here. Death doesn't have to mean the end of caring or contributing." The living residents of the surrounding neighborhood seemed to sense the protection the cemetery provided. Despite being located in a high-crime area, Crescent Hill experienced remarkably little vandalism or criminal activity. Drug dealers avoided the area. Gang members found other places to conduct business. Teenagers looking for trouble consistently decided to cause problems elsewhere. Bobby began to understand that he wasn't just a security guard. He was a liaison between the living and the dead, helping to maintain a partnership that kept the cemetery peaceful and the surrounding community safer. The logbook became Bobby's manual for managing supernatural residents. When Mrs. Patterson complained that visitors to her husband's grave were leaving beer cans instead of flowers, Bobby worked with the groundskeepers to install a small sign requesting appropriate tributes. When the veterans group reported suspicious activity near the mausoleum, Bobby coordinated with police to investigate potential break-in attempts. Most importantly, Bobby learned to serve as messenger between the deceased residents and their living families. Many of the dead wanted to communicate comfort or forgiveness or final words of love to surviving relatives, but few living people were capable of hearing them directly. Bobby would visit families during his off hours, introducing himself as cemetery security and sharing messages disguised as observations about grave maintenance or visitor patterns. Your father's grave always has fresh flowers, even during the winter, he might tell a grieving daughter. It's like someone who loved him is still taking care of it. Or to a son struggling with guilt. I've worked here for months now, and I can tell you that your mother's grave has the most peaceful feeling of anywhere in the cemetery. Whatever pain she experienced, she's past it now. The families found comfort in these messages without ever knowing their supernatural source. Bobby worked at Crescent Hill for 12 years before a second heart attack forced his retirement. During that time, he trained 3 different assistants who eventually moved on to other jobs. But none of them lasted long enough to become full liaisons with the permanent residents. When Bobby finally retired, Harold Fisher had one final conversation with him. "You've been good for this place, Bobby. The residents appreciate everything you've done. What happens now? Who's going to listen to you?" "The same thing that happened when I died and when Mike retired and when Dave moved to Florida. Eventually, the right person comes along. Someone who cares more about helping than about what's possible or logical." Bobby's replacement was Maria Santos, a former hospice nurse in her 50s. Bobby spent 2 weeks training her in the official duties, but he never mentioned the supernatural residents. That revelation had to happen naturally in its own time. 3 weeks after Bobby left, Maria called him at home. "Bobby, I need to ask you something, and please don't think I'm losing my mind. But are there people in this cemetery who aren't exactly alive?" Bobby smiled. "What makes you ask?" "Someone's been leaving notes for me. Instructions about which sections need extra attention, which families might need comfort, that sort of thing. The handwriting is from different people, but they all sign their notes as permanent residents." "Maria, let me ask you something. How do you feel about things that can't be explained logically?" And so the legacy continued. Harold Fisher and the permanent residents of Crescent Hill Cemetery found another living partner willing to listen, to care, and to help maintain the delicate balance between the world of the living and the eternal community of the dead. The logbook gained new entries. The cemetery remained peaceful. The neighborhood stayed safer than its surrounding crime statistics suggested possible. And somewhere in the space between life and death, a group of dedicated individuals continued to prove that caring doesn't end with the last heartbeat. It just finds new ways to serve. Stanley Richardson had been the night watchman at Riverside Memorial Gardens for 31 years when he received the diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months to live, maybe 8 with treatment. At 74, Stanley could have retired years earlier, but Riverside had become more than a job. It was his calling, his purpose, his home away from home. The idea of leaving the cemetery unguarded, even temporarily, was unacceptable to a man who'd never missed a shift in 3 decades. But Stanley faced a problem that went beyond his own mortality. Riverside Memorial Gardens held secrets that only he knew, responsibilities that couldn't be transferred to just anyone, and residents who depended on him in ways the cemetery board couldn't imagine. Riverside Memorial Gardens sprawled across 85 acres of rolling hills outside Nashville, established in 1950 to serve the growing post-war population. Unlike urban cemeteries hemmed in by development, Riverside maintained its pastoral character, ancient oak trees, meandering paths, and natural landscaping that made it feel more like a park than a burial ground. Stanley had started working there in 1993, originally as a groundskeeper. The night watchman position opened when the previous guard, an elderly man named Thomas Webb, died at his desk during a routine shift. Stanley volunteered for the night work because he'd always been a light sleeper, and the pay differential helped support his wife's medical expenses. What Stanley discovered was that Thomas Webb had been doing much more than routine security work. Hidden in the security office filing cabinet was a collection of journals, photographs, maps, and correspondence that revealed the true scope of the night watchman's responsibilities at Riverside. The cemetery was home to over 40,000 permanent residents, but it also served as a way station for something much more unusual: souls in transition who weren't ready to move on to whatever came after death. Thomas Webb had been helping these transitional spirits for 15 years, serving as guide, counselor, and sometimes stern authority figure for the dead who couldn't or wouldn't accept their own passing. His journals detailed hundreds of encounters with confused spirits, vengeful ghosts, lost souls, and other supernatural entities that were drawn to Riverside's peaceful atmosphere. Stanley's first supernatural encounter came during his second week on the night shift. While conducting his midnight patrol, he found an elderly woman sitting on a bench near the children's section, crying softly. "Ma'am, the cemetery is closed to visitors after dark. Are you okay? Do you need help getting home?" The woman looked up, and Stanley saw immediately that something was wrong. Her clothes were from several decades past, her hair styled in a way no one had worn since the 1960s, and her eyes held a confusion that went deeper than ordinary disorientation. "I can't find my baby," she said. "I've been looking everywhere, but I can't find where they buried my baby." Stanley felt a chill of recognition. He'd read about similar encounters in Thomas Webb's journals. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Dorothy Henderson. My baby died in 1967. The hospital said they would take care of everything, but I never saw where they put him. I've been looking for so long." Stanley checked his memory of the cemetery records. Dorothy Henderson was buried in Section K, died in 1969, but there was no record of an infant Henderson burial. "Mrs. Henderson, what's the last thing you remember clearly?" Dorothy thought carefully. "I was in the hospital. They said the baby was too small, that he wouldn't survive. I remember them taking him away, and then I was here, looking for him." Stanley realized he was dealing with a spirit who had died without resolution, unable to move on because of unfinished business. According to Thomas Webb's journals, this was one of the most common reasons for supernatural activity at Riverside. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to help you find your baby, but first I need to research some records. Can you wait here?" Stanley spent the rest of his shift researching Dorothy Henderson's case. What he discovered was heartbreaking but not uncommon for the 1960s. Dorothy had given birth to a severely premature infant who lived for only a few hours. Hospital policy at the time was to handle such deaths quietly, often without involving the parents in burial arrangements. The baby had been buried in an unmarked grave in the hospital cemetery, which was later absorbed into Riverside Memorial Gardens when the medical facility expanded. The tiny grave was in an area that had been converted to a memorial garden, with no headstone or marker to indicate its location. The next night, Stanley found Dorothy Henderson sitting on the same bench. "Mrs. Henderson, I found your baby. Would you like me to show you where he's buried?" Dorothy's face lit up with the first joy Stanley had seen there. "You found him? Really? Stanley led her to the memorial garden, to a specific rose bush that, according to his research, grew directly above the unmarked infant grave. "Your baby is here," Stanley said gently. "He's been here all along, just waiting for you to find him." Dorothy knelt beside the rose bush, placing her hands on the earth. As she did, Stanley watched something remarkable happen. The confusion and desperation that had marked her features faded, replaced by peace and understanding. "He's so small," Dorothy whispered, "but he's safe. He's been safe all along." "Yes, ma'am. He's been waiting for you." Dorothy stood and looked at Stanley with clear eyes for the first time. "Thank you. I can rest now." She faded like morning mist, leaving behind only the scent of roses and a sense of profound peace. Over the following 31 years, Stanley helped hundreds of transitional spirits find what they needed to move on. Lost soldiers seeking their units, children looking for parents, spouses searching for each other. All drawn to Riverside because its peaceful atmosphere made communication between worlds easier. Stanley developed his own methods, building on Thomas Webb's foundation but adapting to his own personality and strengths. Where Webb had been scholarly, keeping detailed academic notes, Stanley was more intuitive, relying on empathy and common sense to understand what each spirit needed. He also expanded the scope of his work. In addition to helping confused spirits move on, Stanley began mediating conflicts between the living and the dead, translating messages from deceased family members to their survivors, and maintaining the delicate balance that kept Riverside peaceful for both worlds. The cemetery board never knew about Stanley's supernatural duties. His official reports described routine security work, checking gates, monitoring for vandalism, maintaining equipment. But his real job was invisible, measurable only in the peace and tranquility that made Riverside Memorial Gardens one of the most beloved cemeteries in the region. Now, facing his own mortality, Stanley confronted the most important challenge of his career: finding and training a successor who could handle not just the security work, but the spiritual responsibilities that came with the night shift at Riverside. Stanley's first choice was Kevin Murphy, a young military veteran with security experience and a respectful attitude toward death. But after 3 weeks of training, Kevin quit abruptly, claiming the cemetery was too weird for his comfort level. His second choice, Margaret Walsh, lasted even less time. A former police officer with 20 years of experience handling unusual situations, she requested a transfer after 1 week, citing atmospheric disturbances that interfered with her sleep. Stanley was beginning to panic. His cancer was progressing faster than expected. His strength was declining, and he couldn't find anyone willing or able to take over the full scope of his responsibilities. That's when he met Rachel Torres. Rachel was 38, a former social worker who'd left her job after burnout from dealing with the foster care system. She applied for the night watchman position because she needed work that wasn't emotionally demanding, something quiet where she could process her own disappointments about not being able to save every child who needed help. Stanley liked Rachel immediately. She had the empathy necessary for dealing with confused spirits, the patience required for long-term problem solving, and most importantly, the calling to help others even when that help went unrecognized. But Stanley was running out of time. His doctor had revised the prognosis downward to 3 months, and Stanley could feel his strength ebbing. He needed to accelerate Rachel's training, to share 31 years of experience in the few weeks he had remaining. "Rachel, I need to tell you something about this job that wasn't in the official description," Stanley said during her second week of training. "What kind of something?" "The kind that makes some people think the night watchman position is cursed and makes other people understand it's actually blessed." Stanley spent his remaining weeks teaching Rachel everything he'd learned about helping transitional spirits. He shared Thomas Webb's original journals, his own notes and observations, and most importantly, the intuitive understanding that came from decades of listening to the needs of the dead. The key, Stanley explained, is to remember that death doesn't automatically make someone wise or peaceful. Dead people have the same problems, fears, and unfinished business they had when they were alive. Your job is to help them work through those issues so they can move on. Rachel proved to be a natural at the work. Her social work background had prepared her for dealing with people in crisis, and her compassion allowed her to hear what spirits needed even when they couldn't articulate it clearly. 2 weeks before Stanley's death, he had his final supernatural encounter at Riverside Memorial Gardens. During what would be his last patrol, Stanley found himself in the oldest section of the cemetery, near the original graves from the 1950s. Standing beneath an ancient oak tree was a figure Stanley had never seen before. A tall man in his 60s wearing the uniform of a cemetery groundskeeper. "You must be Stanley Richardson," the man said. "I'm Thomas Webb." Stanley felt a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You're the night watchman who died before I started working here." "That's right. I've been watching your work for 31 years. You've done well, Stanley. Better than I ever did. I learned everything from your journals." Thomas smiled. "You learned the basics from my journals. Everything else, the compassion, the intuition, the dedication, that came from your own heart." Stanley looked around the cemetery that had been his responsibility for 3 decades. "I'm dying, Thomas. I won't be able to finish what we started here." "Who says you won't finish it? Death didn't stop me from caring about this place. It won't stop you either." Stanley understood. "You want me to stay, like you did. I want you to choose. Moving on is always an option. There's peace waiting for you. Rest you've more than earned. But if you want to continue the work, there's a way to do that too." "What about Rachel? She's just learning." "Rachel will be fine. She has good instincts and a caring heart. But she could benefit from an experienced guide, someone who understands both the living and the dead." Stanley spent his remaining 2 weeks considering Thomas's offer. He could choose to move on to whatever came after death, or he could remain as a spiritual guardian of Riverside Memorial Gardens, helping future night watchmen and continuing to assist transitional souls. The decision became clear during his final conversation with Rachel. "I won't be here much longer," Stanley told her during what they both knew would be his last night of training. "I know, and I'm scared I won't be able to do this work without you." "You will. You have everything you need." "But Rachel, if something happens to me, if I'm not around in the usual sense, don't be surprised if you still get help sometimes. Guidance that seems to come from nowhere." Rachel looked at him carefully. "Stanley, are you trying to tell me something?" "I'm trying to tell you that caring doesn't end with death. And sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned to see both sides of existence." Stanley Richardson died peacefully in his sleep 3 days later. His funeral was held at Riverside Memorial Gardens, attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched during his years as night watchman. The cemetery board struggled to find adequate words to honor a man who'd provided 3 decades of faithful service without ever missing a shift. Rachel Torres officially became the night watchman at Riverside Memorial Gardens. Her first week alone on the job was terrifying. She felt unprepared for the supernatural responsibilities Stanley had described, uncertain about her ability to help confuse spirits or mediate between worlds. But during her second week, Rachel began to notice that she wasn't entirely alone. Equipment that should have malfunctioned worked perfectly. Problems that seemed insurmountable somehow resolved themselves. And when she encountered her first transitional spirit, a young man who died in a motorcycle accident and couldn't understand why his family was grieving, Rachel found herself knowing exactly what to say, as if someone was whispering guidance in her ear. "Don't be afraid," Rachel told the confused spirit. "Death is just a transition, not an ending. Your family grieves because they love you, not because you did anything wrong. The spirit looked at her with growing understanding. But how do I help them stop hurting? By showing them you're okay. By letting them feel your love instead of your absence. As Rachel spoke, she felt a warm presence beside her, offering support and approval. She couldn't see Stanley Richardson, but she knew he was there, keeping his promise to help her succeed in the work they both loved. Rachel worked as night watchman at Riverside Memorial Gardens for 15 years before training her own successor. During that time, she helped over 300 transitional spirits find peace, mediated countless conflicts between the living and the dead, and maintained the spiritual balance that made Riverside a place of comfort rather than fear. When Rachel finally retired, she chose to move on to whatever waited beyond death, confident that the work would continue. Her successor, a former hospice chaplain named David Chun, proved equally capable of handling the supernatural responsibilities that came with the position. But Stanley Richardson remained, choosing service over rest, responsibility over reward. Visitors to Riverside Memorial Gardens sometimes reported seeing an elderly man in groundskeeper's clothes tending to neglected graves or comforting families during difficult visits. The cemetery board attributed these sightings to the kindness of volunteer helpers, never realizing they were seeing the dedication of someone who'd found his true calling and refused to let death interfere with his work. In the security office filing cabinet, new journals joined the collection started by Thomas Webb and continued by Stanley Richardson. Each night watchman added their own observations, encounters, and solutions to the growing manual for managing supernatural residents. The work continued, the legacy passed from one caretaker to the next, proof that some responsibilities transcend the boundary between life and death. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the cemetery settled into peaceful silence, those who listened carefully could sometimes hear Stanley Richardson's voice offering guidance to his successors. The key is to remember that everyone, living or dead, just needs someone who cares enough to listen. Emma Chin had never planned to work in a cemetery. At 28, she'd been a successful software engineer in Silicon Valley, building applications and algorithms that connected millions of people around the world. But when her grandmother died, leaving Emma a modest inheritance and a profound sense that her tech career was ultimately meaningless, she made a radical change. The night security position at Maplewood Cemetery outside Portland seemed like the perfect opportunity to slow down, reflect, and figure out what she really wanted to do with her life. What Emma didn't expect was to discover that her technical skills and her grandmother's spiritual wisdom would combine to revolutionize how the living and dead communicate in the digital age. Maplewood Cemetery was established in 1932, serving the growing suburbs of Portland with a more modern approach to burial and memorialization. Unlike the dense urban cemeteries of the East Coast, Maplewood spread across 60 acres of carefully landscaped grounds with wide paths, mature trees, and sections dedicated to different religious and cultural communities. Emma's interview for the night security position was conducted by Margaret Foster, the cemetery's operations manager, who seemed surprised by Emma's qualifications. Most people who apply for this job are either retired or between careers, Margaret said. You're young, educated, have a successful background in technology. Why do you want to work nights at a cemetery? Emma tried to explain without sounding like she was having a quarter-life crisis. I spent 6 years building apps that help people share their lives online. But when my grandmother died, I realized I'd never actually helped anyone deal with the important things: loss, grief, the need to maintain connections with people who are gone. I want to do work that matters in a more fundamental way. Margaret nodded. Well, the job is straightforward. Patrol the grounds, monitor security systems, handle any after-hours issues. It's quiet work, gives you plenty of time to think. What Margaret didn't mention, because she didn't know, was that Maplewood Cemetery had been experiencing unusual activity for the past 6 months. The previous night guard had quit abruptly, claiming that the job was too stressful. His replacement lasted only 2 weeks. A third guard made it through 1 month before requesting a transfer to day shift work. Emma started her first night shift in November, immediately noticing that Maplewood felt different from other places she'd worked. There was an atmosphere of expectancy, as if something was waiting to happen. Her grandmother, who'd been born in China and maintained traditional beliefs about ancestral spirits, would have called it spiritual activity. Emma's first encounter with the supernatural came during her second week, while she was learning to use the cemetery's security monitoring system. The closed-circuit cameras covered the main roads and entrance gates, but they also captured activity in the burial sections. Emma was reviewing footage from the previous night when she noticed something impossible: people moving through areas of the cemetery that were supposed to be empty. The figures appeared on camera as semi-transparent shapes, visible enough to trigger motion sensors but ethereal enough that Emma could see through them to the landscape behind. They moved with purpose, stopping at specific graves, kneeling as if in prayer or conversation, then continuing to other locations. Emma's first instinct was to assume equipment malfunction. She debugged enough software to know that most mysterious phenomena had logical explanations. But when she checked the system diagnostics, everything appeared to be functioning normally. Over the following nights, Emma began to notice patterns in the camera footage. The same transparent figures appeared regularly, following consistent routes through the cemetery. They seemed to be visiting graves in a methodical way, as if conducting their own form of maintenance or memorial service. Emma's engineering mind was fascinated by the systematic nature of the activity. These weren't random hauntings or chaotic supernatural events. This was organized, purposeful behavior that followed predictable patterns. During her third week, Emma decided to investigate directly. Instead of just watching the monitors, she would patrol the areas where camera footage showed the most activity. At 2 a.m., Emma walked through Section D, where her cameras had recorded the highest concentration of transparent figures. As she approached the older graves near the back of the section, she began to hear voices. Not frightening ghostly wails or mysterious whispers, but normal conversation. Multiple people discussing practical matters, which graves needed attention, which families hadn't visited recently, concerns about vandalism or weather damage. "Excuse me," Emma called out, feeling slightly ridiculous for talking to empty air. "I'm Emma, the new night security guard. I can hear you talking, but I can't see you. Could you help me understand what's happening here?" The voices stopped immediately. After a long pause, an elderly woman's voice responded. "You can hear us? How is that possible? The previous guards could barely sense our presence." "I don't know how it's possible," Emma admitted, "but I can hear you clearly, and I can see you on the security cameras. You appear as transparent figures moving through the cemetery." "Cameras?" The voice sounded excited. "You mean we show up on your equipment?" Emma felt a spark of inspiration. Her grandmother had always insisted that spirits found ways to communicate using whatever technology was available. Maybe the security system was picking up supernatural activity because the spirits were actively trying to make contact. "Would you like to see the footage? I could show you how you appear on the cameras." Over the following nights, Emma developed an unprecedented partnership with the supernatural residents of Maplewood Cemetery. Using her laptop and portable monitors, she showed them recorded footage of their own activities, helping them understand how they appeared to the living world. The spirits were fascinated by the technology. Many had died decades before security cameras existed, and they were amazed to see themselves captured digitally. More importantly, they began to understand how to use the camera system to communicate more effectively. Emma learned that Maplewood Cemetery was home to about 30 active spirits, people who had chosen to remain connected to the physical world after death, usually because they felt responsible for maintaining their own graves or watching over family burial sites. "We've been trying to communicate with the living for years," explained Helen Morrison, a spirit who had died in 1978. "But most people can't see or hear us directly. The previous guards sensed something unusual, but they couldn't understand what we needed." Emma realized that her technical background gave her a unique advantage in bridging the gap between worlds. Using her programming skills, she began developing custom software to enhance communication with the spirits. Her first innovation was a motion detection algorithm that could distinguish between living humans and supernatural activity. The standard security system triggered alarms for any movement, making it impossible to separate legitimate security concerns from spiritual activity. Emma's code allowed her to filter out supernatural motion, focusing alerts on actual intruders. Her second breakthrough was developing a visual communication system using the security monitors. The spirits learned to trigger specific cameras in sequence, creating patterns that Emma could interpret as messages. One flash meant all clear, 2 flashes meant problem in this section, 3 flashes meant family visitor needs comfort. But Emma's most significant innovation was creating a digital memorial system that allowed spirits to leave messages for their living family members. Working with the cemetery's website developer, Emma built a secure portal where families could leave digital tributes, upload photos, and share memories of their deceased loved ones. What made the system unique was that it also allowed the spirits to respond. Emma couldn't directly translate spiritual communication into text. That would have required admitting to supernatural contact that most families wouldn't believe. Instead, she developed what she called atmospheric responses, subtle changes to the memorial pages that suggested ongoing presence and care. When families uploaded photos, the spirits could trigger software responses that highlighted specific details or memories. When visitors left written tributes, atmospheric responses might include relevant weather changes on the memorial page or the appearance of symbolic images like butterflies or flowers. The system was subtle enough to seem like sophisticated programming while actually representing genuine communication from deceased family members. Emma's innovations transformed Maplewood Cemetery from a place of simple burial into an active center for ongoing relationships between the living and the dead. Families reported feeling more connected to their deceased relatives, more comforted by visits, and more confident that their loved ones continued to exist in some form. The spirits, in turn, felt more useful and connected to the world they'd left behind. Instead of simply existing in an inactive state, they could contribute to family healing and maintain meaningful relationships with their survivors. Emma's work caught the attention of other cemeteries dealing with similar supernatural activity. She began consulting for burial grounds across the country, helping them develop technology-assisted communication systems and training security personnel to work cooperatively with spiritual residents. But her most important achievement was personal. Emma had found a way to combine her technical skills with her grandmother's wisdom about ancestral spirits, creating work that was both professionally satisfying and spiritually meaningful. As Emma settled into her 3rd year as Maplewood's night security supervisor, she reflected on how much her life had changed. She was earning less money than she had in Silicon Valley, working hours that most people would find strange, and dealing with phenomena that couldn't be explained to friends or family. But Emma had found her calling. Every night brought new opportunities to help families maintain connections with their deceased loved ones, to assist spirits in finding peace and purpose, and to bridge the gap between ancient spiritual wisdom and modern technology. During quiet moments in the security office, surrounded by monitors showing both the physical cemetery and the digital memorial interfaces, Emma often thought about her grandmother's advice. Technology is just a tool. What matters is whether you use it to bring people together or drive them apart. Emma Chun had found a way to use technology to bring together not just people, but entire worlds. And in the glow of computer screens and security cameras, surrounded by the grateful presence of spirits who finally felt heard and understood, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. Her grandmother would have been proud. These 10 stories from cemetery night guards across America remind us that death is not the end of human connection, but a transformation of it. From Sarah Morrison's searching for her lost child, to the children of Willowbrook taking care of each other, to Emma Chun bridging worlds with technology, each account reveals that love, responsibility, and caring transcend the boundary between life and death. The men and women who guard our cemeteries at night are more than security personnel. They're witnesses to the enduring power of human bonds, guardians of stories that would otherwise be lost, and sometimes the only bridge between the living and those who've passed on but haven't passed away. These aren't just ghost stories meant to frighten you in the dark hours. They're testimonies to the reality that death doesn't end our deepest connections. It just changes how we express them. Whether you believe in spirits, ghosts, or supernatural phenomena, the emotions these stories explore are universally human. The need to be remembered, the desire to protect those we love, and the hope that our care for others continues even after our last breath. If you found these accounts as compelling as I did, you won't want to miss our next exploration into America's supernatural landscape. Join me as we visit 10 haunted places across the country where the living and dead coexist in ways that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the world around us. From historic battlefields where soldiers still stand guard, to abandoned hospitals where healing continues long after the lights went out, these locations prove that some places hold onto human energy long after humans have departed. Click on the end screen now to discover 10 haunted places in America and continue your journey into the spaces where our world touches something beyond the ordinary. Because once you start listening to these stories, you'll realize they're happening everywhere. You just have to know how to pay attention. Sweet dreams. And remember, the next time you pass a cemetery at night, someone might be watching over more than just the graves.